Great, folks are rolling in. I'm gonna give it maybe like 2 more minutes before we transition. Welcome everybody, welcome to our talk. So grateful for everybody. Text your cohort, let them know we're coming on. Yes, I see another and another. 1 more minute. Okay, welcome. And thank you. Hey, it's good to be back. I hope folks took a wondrous break. Some of you, this is your last semester here. We've been together now for almost 2 years, and you are on your way to finishing up your thesis and your capstone. So grateful for each and every one of you. Some of you are going to be here for another year, less than a year. No, about a year. And, you know, since this program has been really brought by a team of artists and scholars and artist scholars to reshape how we understand our relationship to art and the art world, and really training a new cohort of people that understand art at the intersection of social justice and art at the intersection of abolition. And really, you know, in my experience as an artist and as an organizer, had to choose identities often, and was, as you know, and incredibly misunderstood as artists. And so we really are kind of like open this program up for the folks, and a lot of our folks are already working artists, like they've been in their careers for a long time. And they're already, you know, social justice thinkers or practitioners and have not necessarily been able to do those at the intersection. So we're trying to also train a new team, but we're also trying to create a new path, like a new highway for this conversation. When I first started doing work around ending police violence, I remember going to a bunch of funders and then being like, oh yeah, we don't fund that kind of work. Like nobody's interested in funding police brutality work. And now there's literally entire funding streams for that work, whole brands that are leveraging that conversation to elevate their brand. And so we are also trying to trailblaze and create new pathways for artists. So there's new careers and new highways. These students are brilliant, amazing, honestly, some of my favorite artists, and so excited about introducing one of them, who is going to be in conversation with you. I'm on my phone, so I'm gonna go look at your bio, Scott. So Scott Mescal is a visual artist, youth mentor, and art scholar, born and raised in New Mexico. Scott currently resides in Seattle, Washington, where he exhibits work at Nepantla Cultural Arts Gallery, as well as creating public art projects throughout Seattle focused on multicultural solidarity and community healing.
Thank you, Patrice. So let me just take a moment to thank everybody on the panel. I'm so grateful, Jake and Cindy, for coordinating this. Want to thank Prescott College for the platform and for bringing us all together. Shout out to both the Crenshaw Dairy Mart and the Mistake Room, who, you know, obviously have a lot to do with this gathering as well. And I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody, but yeah, and thanks again to Cindy. I really know you do a lot of groundwork to make these things happen, so appreciate you. So I'd love to introduce our esteemed, oh, Cindy, I saw a hand go up. Was that a question?
That was an accident.
Oh, okay, no problem. The teacher in me is so attuned to seeing those little hands and pausing. So I would like to introduce César Garcia-Alvarez. He is a writer, a scholar, and a producer based in Los Angeles, California. He is the founding executive and artistic director of the Mistake Room, the amazing Mistake Room, an independent space and global reaching platform for art, culture, and ideas. Prior to founding the Mistake Room, César served as Associate Director and Senior Curator of LAX Art and was one of the curators of Made in LA 2012, and in 2013 served as the US Commissioner for the 13th International Cairo Biennial in Egypt. Most recently, he served as co-curator of Desert X 2021 in the Coachella Valley, which blew my socks off. It was so fantastically done. And currently is organizing one of the largest surveys of Latinx art in the US in nearly 2 decades, slated for 2023 across multiple venues in Los Angeles. He is also the principal investigator for forthcoming the Mistake Room exhibition that explores the intersection of art, narrative medicine, and is slated for 2024 as part of the Getty's Pacific Standard Time initiative. It is my pleasure to introduce César Garcia-Alvarez.
Thank you so much, Scott. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge my presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples, the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I want to thank Patrice and Scott for the introduction. Today's conversation is going to be something a little different than what I'm used to doing. It's actually also one of the first public conversations or talks I do since the pandemic started. And there's been a lot of changes since then. And one of the big exercises that has come out over the last year of reflection and thinking not just about my own practice and the work that the Mistake Room does, more so than reflecting on the past, but also sort of thinking about what's coming next. It's been a process of unlearning and unlearning habits that I think a lot of us in spaces like whether it's the academy or the art world have come to understand that are necessary sort of things that we have to do as we reimagine how we can best serve artists and culture makers. I hope that today's conversation will be a little bit more sort of conversation. If you have questions, I know that we have a moment, but if there's anything that you really want to say, please go ahead and send them. I'm happy to have that conversation along the way. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work today in a different way. Usually conversations like this are very disembodied. They are a series of slides of things we have done and accomplished, and usually sort of visual representations of growing CVs and resumes. But today I want to tell you a little bit about me too, a little bit about why I have skin in the game in the work that I do, and why that's reshaping the work that's forthcoming, both personally and sort of the organization that I founded and run. But before we get there, I thought that since I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with artists I've worked with or things that have shaped the organization I run, that we begin where usually all of my work starts, and it's by looking at some art together. I'm gonna share my screen. If I says the host, I'm gonna need the host to let me do that if possible.
It should work now.
Perfect.
Can you?
I'm going to share that now. I'm going to go through some artist projects and kind of get us together in the same space. In the early 1980s, one of Mexico's earliest conceptualists, Ulises Carrion, a gay Mexican man, tried to make a chart that would graph the way gossip and our moms and aunties, chismes, flowed across generations. The project ended up becoming a series of charts and graphs that attempted to track this movement, and a video that turned something that we are accustomed to seeing in a household into a scientific inquiry in which experts were brought in to sort of understand how the conversations and stories and myths that our mothers make could be visualized. Around that same time, the late artist Teresa Burga in Lima, Peru, made a work after the end of the military dictatorship called Profile of the Peruvian Woman, in which she surveyed over 290 women and asked them information about their height, their weight, but also their belief systems, their political affiliations, and attempted to sort of visualize them in other forms that were non-textual, gesturing to the fact that the text in Western language isn't the only form of knowledge making. The work took on the form of charts and graphs, and also later quipu and other sculptural objects. In 1993, Dana Joseph Martinez transformed the museum tags of the Whitney Biennial into a language piece that was meant to spatialize an idea. I can't imagine ever wanting to be white. Collectively, the political statement was sort of received a lot of pushback, but the piece was also much more about the ability to be able to use conceptual mechanisms to speak to the racial politics of the time. In 1994, along the US-Mexico border, artist Marcos Ramirez R. created a shanty house on the outside steps of the Centro Cultural Tijuana. The piece spoke to local politics of the time, but also a bit about the actual living conditions of migrant people along the US-Mexico border. It was a functioning house where the artist bribed local elected officials to be able to get the construction permits to establish it. And also all of the power that the house had to be used was being stolen from the culture institution, essentially transforming the museum or giving the museum the function of a failed utilities infrastructure in the city. Teresa Margolles, an artist who represented Mexico in the Venice Biennale, staged an installation called ¿De qué más podemos hablar? That included a series of sheets in which bodies had been found along various cities of the US-Mexico border as a result of the failed drug-on wars that the Mexican government launched against the cartel. The performative component of the work encompassed the relatives of survivors of killings washing the floor of Mexico's pavilion with water that had been mixed with substances that had been removed or that had been mixed with water that had been used to wash corpses in the Mexico City morgue. Vietnamese American collective, the Propeller Group, is speaking to histories of the Vietnam War, attempted to see if they could isolate the moment of the beginning of violence of the conflict. Using a series of specialized cubes, they were able to capture the perfect moment of impact between bullets of an AK-47 and R-15, the weapons that at the time were used by the United States government and the Soviet Union and that fueled the violence of the Cold War. In 2007, Doris Salcedo created a wound on the floor of the turbine hall of the Tate. Shibboleth became a work much more about lasting presence and dealing with trauma. Today, when you enter the space, you can actually still see the scarification process on the floor, transforming or giving the institution a scar that speaks to the violence that's experienced not only in her native Colombia, but in other war-torn countries around the world. Tul Solar, an artist that was active in the early 20th century in Argentina, was a maker of worlds, a collaborator of Jorge Luis Borges. He created languages and games and imaginary sort of systems of notation that were used to create entire universes. From Argentina's Wolf by Bobby-Chan Goldberg to a collective of artists that spend a lot of time working in a part of Argentina that has one of the largest deposits of meteorites and is believed to have some of the oldest forms of matter in the world. For one of their recent projects, the artists identified one of the oldest meteorites known to exist that have been taken, dismantled by scientists in Europe. One of the halves was in Argentina, the other in Germany. And for their project at Portuguese, the artists were able to bring this old piece of matter back together again for their show. Glenn Kino, an artist local to Los Angeles, did a project in which he collected secrets. What's inside this vault are a series of tapes from interviews in which he asked individuals throughout the city and from various places around the world to share a secret that he committed would never be shared. The work exists as such, and the collector who purchases the work gets to access the object, but not the combination to access its content. Fraiza Solis enlisted collaborators in Peru to literally move a mountain as a performative act. Artist Oscar Murillo transferred a working chocolate factory from Colombia to the galleries of David Jordan in New York in 2015. And one of his lesser known projects, David Hammonds, created a concerto in black and blue, in which in an empty gallery, visitors were giving a light that they could use creating a symphony that was improvised by the visitors in the space. And the last piece, which actually I have no image of, was a work that I was unable to realize with an artist named Camilo Ontiveros for the 2012 LA Biennial. The artist proposed at the time, it was when the Arizona governor had just imposed the law that law enforcement officers could stop anybody they suspected was undocumented to ask for their documentation. The artist proposed that the staff at the Hammer Museum use the same characterization and identify anybody they thought was undocumented and grant them free museum admission. Clearly, the museum did not allow us to realize the work. I wanted to start with these pieces because they do three things that are very integral to the work that I'm interested in. On the first hand, their sense of existence, their objecthood or thingness is hard to pin down. Thinking about secrecy or secrets as a form or a material, or thinking about what kind of legal processes need to be set in place. The actual forms of these works aren't necessarily what we're used to encountering in more conventional art histories. Second is that they force the institutions or presenting venues to stretch. It forces them to change their relationship in between how they approach art, conserve it, or also present it. But also, and perhaps most importantly, is because they're works that actually made me feel something. I'm an academic by training, a recovering academic now. And that as such, my work comes from a practice that's rooted in a Western intellectual tradition that's built on the belief that racialized, queer, and otherly abled bodies, that their worldviews and ideas are unreasonable and untrue. Writing, scientific method, and other forms of research are the practices that usually we are expected to use to encounter work of art through its history. These works immediately, usually, if we were to encounter them, push us to engage with certain things. Maybe we have to talk about language or aesthetics of information when dealing with Daniel's work or Teresa Burgas, or geopolitics and violence when we see Teresa's work, or the work of the Propeller Group, mysticism, if we're talking about Sul Solar, conceptualism and its formal qualities, or even the performative when we're thinking about Hammonds and Camilo Ontiveros. But there's other ways of seeing this work too. And there's other ways of experiencing them. When I think of Teresa Margolles' work, I see myself in the people who mopped that floor, as I too am the relative of somebody who was lost to the narco violence in Tijuana. When I think about R's work, I think about the first homes my family had to endure and live with when we came to this country. When I think about Daniel Joseph Martinez's work, I think so much about my own career as a curator and the way that a moment during the culture wars ended up shaping the fact that I have been tasked or asked almost to remove my biography and my sense of self from what I do and make most of my career about the work. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of overlap between that and the immigrant household that I grew up in. I grew up in a home where we weren't allowed to whine or complain, where we were lucky to simply be here, where everything about us had to be shaped by what we could do and not who we were. That difference between criticality and a critical intimacy has shaped so much of my interest and fueled so much of what I've done today in my career. Unfortunately, it's also been one of the most difficult things to do. For me, in the last couple of months, I've been thinking so much about what it may mean to have an embodied curatorial practice, one that doesn't necessarily shy away from using the word I, a practice that doesn't shy away from being transparent about the stakes that it's invested in, or about why it does the things that it does. And at the same time, it's also so different than the way that I've been taught to actually engage and forge the work that I do. What I'm going to share today is a series of contradictions, and I hope that maybe in some way at the end, we can have a conversation about how one might negotiate those two positions. On the one hand, the disembodied professional is almost expected to navigate spaces that sort of already exist in this industry. And on the other hand, a truer and perhaps most present form of practice that allows us to not just navigate through those spaces, but to dismantle them and make our own. My career has always started with alternative art spaces, I always work, and alternative art space is also a very American word. It assumes that there already is a center that these spaces are pushing back against, where that isn't necessarily the case in other places around the world. So it's also a very Western construct. But in non-museological spaces, I think is a better way of saying it. I spend a lot of time at LAXART, which is a local nonprofit here in LA, doing more conventional exhibitions, even in alternative art space, but still within the confines of the Stairway White Cube. Experimental projects that allowed artists to push a form or experiment with a new development, but where exhibitions still anchored the work or the program of the space. Later, as I sort of developed my own practice, I was more interested in figuring out not just how to work in spaces, but how I could create spaces for artists to work in. And that, from a very kind of basic standpoint, took me out of the gallery wall itself. Some of my earlier curatorial projects used different sites in which artists could develop projects. This is a project by Joe Kayak, in which we converted an old Mazda truck into a puppet theater that would jump on the highways in Los Angeles at around 5 to 6 p.m. every day. The truck would open up and a radio transmitter will go on that you could listen to in your car, essentially transforming the space of the commute into an intimate space of performance. In 2012, I worked with artist Mark DeSilvero to recreate the Artist Tower of Protest, which was a sort of iconic work staged during the time of the Vietnam War here in Los Angeles, just a couple of blocks from where this was staged in Sunset Boulevard, in which artists were asked to create protest signs that covered this large monumental structure. For a biennial space, after kind of doing public projects in these spaces, I also, every sort of engagement, tried to figure out how I could push beyond the conventional confines of the framework in which you're working in. Biennials, these large scale exhibitions are really horrible beasts. They're really tricky for curators, but also not always really advantageous for artists. In this instance, in 2008, there was a California biennial that is now defunct. And I served on the curatorial team, mostly working on the deterritorialized parts of the show. Rather than having a single exhibition, the idea was to transport the biennial into a multiplicity of sites all across the state, from the US-Mexico border all the way up to San Francisco and even further up in Northern California. So we transformed multiple sites and created public projects that extended this sort of multi-sided show. These are just some images of some of these interventions. There's a project at Queens Mills Annex, an now defunct community space in San Francisco, a public project by Getty Caesar, and an iteration of the high desert test site in Joshua Tree. In 2012, when I was completing doctoral work, mostly in South America and the Middle East, looking at the history of non-conventional spaces, I sort of was called back by my day job and assigned a new biennial as a project along with 4 curators. This is perhaps one of the last more conventional large-scale shows that I've done. This was about 8 years ago. It was the first made in LA exhibition. And even then, sort of our very kind of small attempt to try to sort of shift the way that the institution operated was to not have the exhibition be centered in West the museum, but also use the gallery more accessible to other communities in the city, and completely handing over, there's also at Bonsall, completely handing over the space, the former space of LAXART to a collective language to sort of see how you could display or show the work of a group of artists that did community-based work. So the space was transformed to operate as a site for workshops and different kinds of programs. In 2013, I had an interesting opportunity that really begins to shape so much of the work that I do now. I was appointed US Commissioner for the Cairo Biennial in Egypt at the height of the Arab Spring. I got to spend a significant amount of time in Egypt, working mostly with community-based groups, a lot of them Islamic, more conservative groups of cultural producers, to try to create a sort of programmatic series that created some kinds of relationships between American culture makers and at the time, artists and other makers in Egypt. The project would be anchored around an exhibition by an artist. This is a rendering for a project that was meant to create a sand city inside a pavilion. But the exhibition proper was never realized. And what ended up happening was that it was only the collaborations and the work leading up to the project that ended up becoming like, the forms that the project actually realized in. From working with Tahrir Cinema, which was a collective of citizen journalists, to sort of doing studio visits and sort of an experimental school out of another local nonprofit. The kind of work here that began to shape for me was one that made me realize that the exhibition didn't necessarily have to be the center of the work. That is something very difficult to do in the United States, mostly because of funding models that privilege the making of objects and have a difficult time understanding that other kind of work, whether it be activist work, whether it be organizing, is also a part of a creative practice. So process-based initiatives at the time became for me a really more important part of the end result of an exhibition project. And the time that I spent in Cairo was really formative to that. And it led to another project that sort of overlaps the beginning of me starting the Mistake Room. I don't really speak about much, but for 2 to 3 years, I brought artists along on a residency on a boat to various island nations across the Pacific and asked them to do nothing. The project was part of a triennial funded by the Thyssen Bornemisza Foundation in Vienna that tried to create opportunities for the intersection of art and environmental advocacy. Turning a research vessel into a residency hub for artists, I invited filmmakers and poets and writers to Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea to actually not be asked to produce anything. It was a disorienting experience and a very experimental one to be able to provide funds for a pause, to be able to give artists the opportunity to simply make. I don't have shareable documentation of this project, but it did lead to thinking about what a space could look like that didn't operate in traditional timelines or through traditional programs as sort of we were used to. And that's sort of when I made the decision to start the Mistake Room. This is just a recent project that I worked on, which was Desert X, and I'll come back to it if I have time. But a lot of my sort of academic research was looking at these spaces, just opportunity to spend time with artists, thinking about the kinds of spaces and fostering that they needed beyond, just being given the gallery space in which to put their works. It started to sort of give me an opportunity to go back to a lot of the research I had done. These are some spaces that exist in other parts of the world where the making of objects isn't the expectation for an artist. Galeria Callejera at the top right is a series of modified community trailers of different scales that communities can rent out to use as temporary museum spaces in Chile. The space to the right was Estación Tijuana. It was a building that was adjacent to the wall dividing the US and Mexico in San Isidro and Tijuana, that was used as a space for screenings and performances at a time when most civic institutions have really sort of collapsed at the height of the sort of cartel wars. The other image you have is Tahrir Cinema, a network of citizen journalists and artists that during the time of the media shutdown in Cairo would create routes of distribution to make sure that people who were recording what was happening in Alexandria, up or down the river, that other people knew that the protests were actually happening elsewhere in the country, which the government stopped to do. And they took over the central square, would have runners, and create a sophisticated sort of distribution system that would bring all of this captured content to be displayed for community members of different sites of gathering throughout Egypt. and SOMA, which is an active schools that provides an alternative to a formal MFA program in Mexico City. A lot of these spaces lead to some of the work we've done at the Mistake Room. And before the Mistake Room assumed the form that it did, it actually was imagined and dreamed of very, very differently. First and foremost, the Mistake Room was never intentioned to be a nonprofit space. We had conversations about our understanding of the nonprofit model as one that was incredibly disadvantageous to working class people, looking at the nonprofit industrial complex as one of the mechanisms that prevented most folks of color, working class people, to be able to have access in the arts. And so our process began very differently before we had a space. At first, we did pop-ups that were anonymous exhibitions as an exercise to see if lazy writers and art critics could actually really write about art. So we refused to give people the name of the artist exhibiting or the curator organizing the show to see if anybody was actually able to learn how to look at an artwork again, rather than have most of the writing be a repetition of their accomplishments in previous exhibitions. And as our first funding model, we made shoes. I haven't seen these images in a long time myself. We worked with Creative Recreation on an idea, and we formed a brand called Conceptual Application, CONAP. And the idea was that CONAP would be the sustaining mechanism for this space, and that it would be an artist-driven funding initiative. We would pair up an artist with a different company or brand to create a commercial product that could be sold, and that then had a fiduciary relationship to the non-commercial aspect of the work. This was a collaboration between Glenn Kiner and Rich Kofinko, the founder of Creative Recreation. These shoes were sold at Barney's and actually gave us the starting money to get the Mistake Room started. There were other series of projects for conceptual application that we wanted to realize that unfortunately we really couldn't get the buy-in for. And I think that we had a lot of sort of visions for what the space would actually look like, that at the time, and this was in 2012 and 13, seemed different and made a lot of people uncomfortable. And the reality was that at the time, I also didn't have the sort of experience, and I wouldn't say experience, but I didn't necessarily have the network and buy-in that I needed as a 26-year-old who had left a previous employment situation that was not ideal for a person of color, to sort of figure out how to build a space of my own. But this is sort of how our beginning started. We eventually became a 501c3 space in our attempt to create a little bit of clarity around the kind of project we wanted to create, and decided that we would sort of split our efforts twofold. One would be the program, that would be the outward facing project. The other would be the institutional one. And what that meant was that our board would be composed 100% of people of color, that our staff would be people of color, that we would hire undocumented folks to be able to be an entry point into this industry. The quiet work that originally was meant to be the beating soul of the space ended up becoming the back end, the one that we don't talk about often, and yet use this sort of front end work on the exhibitions to be able to support that. We also did some less unconventional things. Like with less conventional things. We started to rent out the space for commercial gallery residencies, which was strangely, in terms of thinking, any time that there was an attempt to change the model of operating, the resistance from both peers and I think broader funders and supporters was difficult. We opened up a space in Mexico, which really has become our experimental sort of opportunity. We partner with a local nonprofit and have been running residencies and experimental art schools in a place that doesn't have an MFA program, to really sort of develop some of the work that we want to do here. But I think over the last year, we've made a very conscious decision about the work that we're doing moving forward. The organization itself is transforming pretty radically. And part of that is part of a process, really thinking of emancipating ourselves from a series of structures that don't allow the kinds of practices that we want to support to be able to be realized, but also, and perhaps more personally, that are also very invested in creating this separation between bringing our whole selves to the work, whatever that may look like, rather than creating a product that is consumable to people who usually aren't like us. It's a different sort of place to be in for the work. What I can tell you for now is that our forthcoming exhibitions won't happen in a regular schedule. The kinds of activities that will support will no longer be exhibition centric. And the exhibition as a form will no longer dictate the way that we operate curatorially. It's taken about 10 years to be able to realize this work and to get here. It's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. I am very ready to make people uncomfortable. It took time for us to get here, but so much of the previous work that both I engaged with as an academic and then also as an early curator ended up what sort of is informing the path forward for the work that we're going to do. And I think I'm out of time, and I want to sort of maybe move to the discussion and have people ask any questions at this time.
While we're waiting for a couple of questions to roll in, I just want to thank you for that. That was fantastic and so rich, so many rich artists that you shared with us, and your work is inspiring.
Thank you. See, how did you evolve into this relationship and a profit model? How did you evolve into this new relationship to challenging the nonprofit model? It's very personal, to be quite frank. And I think for me, I came into the idea of starting a space knowing that I did not want it to be a nonprofit. And honestly felt like I had no other option at the time to do it. And one of the reasons I didn't want it to be a nonprofit was because the big question that was looming over me was who can afford to do this? And the nonprofit model is not really supportive of folks who aren't wealthy off the get-go. This conversation makes a lot of my colleagues very uncomfortable. And it doesn't necessarily take away from the merits that some other colleagues of color do and work in institutions, but if you start reading between the lines, what you come to learn about the field is that most of the people, even people of color for the most part, come from upper middle class households. They could afford to take that $20,000 fellowship because their parents paid for their apartment rent in New York, or because they could actually, get themselves into debt, have a supportive family and be able to do that. Or you read about how some really respectable curators grew up, in households where their parents were collectors, but that's not the case for other people. And the question for me was always like, what does it mean if the only folks of color who can work in this industry are those who, went to Harvard Westlake and can come out and dial all of their alum and their family's friends and build their founding endowment for a space. I worked at a space that operated like that, where a director could pick up the phone and call their aunt whenever we needed help with cash flow. And what happens if you're not in a position to be able to do that? What happens if your network isn't as expansive, or you don't have access to those resources? The nonprofit model is very dependent on a kind of philanthropic giving that was created to make rich people feel less bad about the fucked up shit that they did to everybody else. And that's not just in the arts, but that's across like all nonprofits. People get paid really shitty. It is hard to build a sustained infrastructure. And yet at the same time, you have a lot of folks that aren't compensated for the work that, for their labor that essentially is making money for other people. I thought a lot about that in challenging the nonprofit. I started off essentially saying I didn't want to do it and felt like at the time I had no way out. I also think in LA in particular, and it was a specific case, at the time when I opened the Mistake Room, there was 2 other brick and mortar spaces, and then small ones, and then big museums. So I know that a lot of Angelenos, especially in the art world, like to think that LA is the center of the universe, but it isn't. And when folks keep talking about thinking about new models, they're not new, they exist elsewhere. So at the time, I wanted to sort of reconfigure existing models that I was aware of from other places around the world, because the reality is that most independent spaces elsewhere have always operated in some kind of hybrid capacity, because
Yep.
they've had to play multiple roles. They've had to be the museum, the commercial gallery, the art seller, the educational program, because there wasn't any other institutions to fill in those gaps. So those models exist in other places and have become self-sufficient. And I think that coming into it, I felt like I had to sort of put in a little bit of work up front to create some clarity. Unfortunately, I feel like I don't necessarily know if the evolution and growth and education that I had hoped that both my colleagues and support base would sort of eventually embrace, I don't know if we ever got there. And yet I think that the biggest lesson over the last year is that every single thing we already knew would go wrong in case of a disaster went wrong exactly as we knew it would. And people couldn't sustain these spaces, and people couldn't sustain this work. And one of my growing frustrations, as I've continued to be part of multiple groups with some of my colleagues, is that everybody seems to be waiting around for normalcy to return. I refuse to go back to that way of operating. And I think if, particularly for institutions that want to be able to build more inclusive governance, structures for themselves, that want to be able to really be able to provide like dignified jobs for participation in this industry, we're going to need to learn to be self-sufficient. Otherwise, it's the voices of those who are funding us and everybody else who wants to have their say in the way these models work that are going to shape the work that we do. So I always sort of knew that this is what I wanted to do. And we've always had the playbook ready to go. I just didn't necessarily have the opportunity or the moment where I felt like we could survive institutionally while implementing some of these changes. And the situation is different now. And I think what's also helpful is to see other models and other spaces, like, Crenshaw Dairy Mart's been a remarkable sounding board, because for the first time in a very long time, we feel like we're speaking to peers that understand the world in the way that we operate. And I think that there's others, more spaces that are coming around to seeing that we need to start taking ownership of our work in our institutions if we're able to really have them sort of realize their full vision. So I'm really excited about the work that's coming. I know it's going to piss off a lot of people, colleagues and that, but I'm also ready to have those conversations and hopefully push some people to come along with us.
Love all the heart.
I think we have time for just one quick one. Somebody had asked, when you're not busy doing the beautiful work you do, how do you recover? How do you heal? How do you rest?
That's a powerful question. I was very sick a year ago, during the beginning of COVID, and I had a pretty severe case of it. I am a longer. I've had multiple procedures for things that I'm still not very comfortable speaking about. But it was a really interesting course correct. I think part of diving into this work in a different way has also made me realize that I need to be fully present in other aspects of my life as a person. Learning to feel like a person became incredibly necessary, as opposed to just, becoming an opportunity for people or a list of sort of things that I could do. And so the last year, I'm not going to say that it's easy to rest, but I am working very hard to do that. And there's 3 sort of big things that have transformed my life a little bit. I think one of them has been, I grew up in a dancing family and I used to salsa dance in college. And I used to be that weird guy that used to teach a 9 to 10 p.m. salsa class at the nightclub before the nightclub opened. And that was a really big part of my life. And I'm dancing again, which a couple nights a week, and I'm teaching. And then the other part is this is gonna sound so weird, but I also started I met a fitness coach named Angela Manuel Davis, who has a studio called Army. That was always very intimidating for me and getting accustomed to existing in my body again. And it's been a game changer for the other one. And then the other one is that I started dating again, and my partner has sort of really forced me to allow myself to be loved and to love. And it has been, it's amazing to be able to share a life with someone like that. And that's not something that I had afforded, that I'd, given myself. And so that's sort of how I recover and what keeps me grounded.
All right, thank you so much, Cesar. The time went so fast, but we are at the end of our lecture. So I just want to thank all the folks who helped make this possible. And thank you so much, Cesar, for your time and this amazing presentation you've given us.
Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. This is our start back from our short break. So if anybody missed the beginning, we are recording it. You'll be able to see it. We'll have it up as soon as possible. But yeah, again, thank you, Cesar. Thank you, Scott, Patrice, everybody. So now we'll just, we're gonna close the room and we'll start the studio visit.